And everyone. Welcome back to Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Hena Zuberi, and you're watching us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused TV network. You can always watch Muslim Network TV on Apple, on Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and Galaxy 19 satellite, where we beam all over Canada, United States, and Mexico. So today our topic is Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry, and how you counter that, especially on using traditional media, digital media. We want to talk a little bit about lessons learned in 2020 and planning ahead for 2021. With me today are two experts from Rethink Media. Adrienne Mahsa Varkiani is the program director for Rethink Media's Rights and Inclusion team. Prior to this, she was the senior editor at Think Progress. Love Think Progress. Been following them.
Oh, thank you.
Where she worked as the newsroom's policy reporter. And she's also served as an editor for Muftah magazine and worked in the Iranian American community. With us also is Firdaus Arastu. Firdaus is the Senior Communications Associate at the Rights Inclusion team on Muslim artists and culture. She provides strategic communication and media support to projects within Building Bridges program of the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Arts, mashallah. We're really excited to have both Firdaus and Adrienne here with us today. We want to make this show full of tips and just really packed full of information, so all of you watching can use it to plan for your 2021. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
We're excited to be here.
Go ahead. So can you tell me a little bit more, let our audience know a little bit more about Rethink Media? How did it start, and what does it do?
Firdaus, do you want to take this one? Firdaus has been here for much longer than I have.
Happy to. So Rethink started about 11 years ago, and the organization exists to provide communications capacity building to nonprofit organizations that are working on advancing human rights and building our democracy to be more representative and to have a more humane foreign policy and national security system. Mm-hmm. So our team works specifically, as you mentioned, on countering Islamophobia and advancing the rights of Muslims, Arabs, Sikhs, and South Asians in the US. And we have been doing that for about a decade. And we have seen a lot over the past decade in terms of different policies, administrations, and issues in local level places, and supporting organizations both at the national and the local level in doing their media and communications work.
So what, over the past decade, what sort of major projects have you all worked on, or especially when it comes to public relations for the Muslim community or for the Sikh community, things that they've faced, and we know, all of us know, that there's been spikes, and then there'll be, years where it's not as bad, and then suddenly there's, like, before elections, it goes nutty. So can you share some of the highlights with us?
I can go over some of the highlights, and then hopefully Firdaus can add to it. In the past couple years, I would say a lot of our focus has been on these discriminatory policies that have targeted Muslims and non-Muslims. So for example, the Muslim ban, Trump's Muslim ban, is a big one that we've been focused on for the last 4 years. I think around the elections, around 2018 and 2020, there has been a lot of really, really great civic engagement from other Muslim organizations. So voter registration, just getting people to run, getting people really involved in their democracy. So there's been a lot of really good work around that. And so in terms of like Sikh men, Sikh Americans who you mentioned earlier, obviously Islamophobia is not something that just targets Muslims. It's not something that just even targets, Middle Eastern people or South Asian people. It is really a very broad swath of people that come under attack from Islamophobic policies. So we're kind of hoping to help all of them the best that we can.
And when you say help, so if I was a nonprofit, so are individuals helped, or is it an organization that helps other nonprofits? I just wanted to make that clear.
I think it's both. I think a lot of our work is with nonprofits. A lot of it is with groups or movements, and a lot of it is just with like individual experts in their own field. So there isn't really any, I think because we are in the community, we know who to reach out to and we know who we should be working with. So there's no real line like, we can't work with you because you're not a profit. It's not really like that. So I would say if you're doing good work, hopefully we will try to figure out a way to help you.
Okay. So a lot of nonprofits, especially Muslim nonprofits, that, they're a lot of times they're struggling for donations. They don't have developed masajid or even charities. They don't have these developed communication departments. So what does Rethink do for them?
Well, we provide a variety of services. So as Adrienne mentioned, we work with a broad spectrum of organizations. Some are very small nonprofits that work on a local level, all the way to, organizations that are national, that have chapters in multiple cities. And so we work with them to figure out what is their greatest area of need. And also we provide research and data to help inform people's media and communication work. So what we mean by that is we collect and disseminate public opinion and polling information so that organizations know what it is that the American public is thinking and feeling, so that they can craft their media strategy accordingly. And then we also provide trainings and webinars, particularly in the time of COVID, right, when we cannot meet in person, so that people have ongoing support in building their media skills and communications capacity. So that's both on the communication staffer side, what is the needs of a communications director, and then also what's the needs of a spokesperson and senior staff who are going to represent the organization publicly and in a public-facing way.
And this is so important because we've seen how a misstep or just even, and I can go back to perhaps the decade before, where words were twisted, and the Muslim community especially really struggled with this. So this is amazing. And I know, so a lot of times I'll see Rethink Media does send out, you'll track news, and then you'll send out ways to respond to that news. So can you tell me some of the ways that this has been really helpful, like how you were able to shape the narrative when news has come out that has troubled communities that you serve?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in terms of the news gathering, we do have a daily newsletter that hopefully people find helpful. And so we kind of just see what is being said about our community. And we have a pretty good open rate on that newsletter. And I think that's because people want to see what is being said about us. So we look at Muslims, at Sikh Americans, at South Asian Americans. We have a very long list of search terms trying to figure out what is being said about us and how can we respond. And the same newsletter goes to journalists who work on this issue. And so in terms of responding to the news, I think a lot of it is reporter relationships. A lot of it is identifying the news and who the right spokesperson is. I can give one example, and I'm sure Firdaus has others. So during the summer when we saw these racial justice protests going on, I think there are a lot of Black Muslims and there are a lot of non-Black Muslims. And for non-Black Muslims, it was very much a moment where it's like, how do we support our brothers and sisters? So there were a lot of mosques around the country who were using Friday prayers to talk about racial injustice in this country. And so we reached out to a really great reporter at RNS. Her name is Aisha Khan. If you don't follow her, you should. And she wrote an amazing piece about, people who are finally talking about racism in our communities and like how those conversations are going. And so that's a piece that I think we were all really proud of.
Mm. That's and it's so important to document that, because a lot of time, and especially from someone within the community who can understand the nuances, who can understand how far we've come from the past. So that's really, really important. And I always say we need to support Muslim journalists, or at least people who understand the community, and Muslim media, because that framing of that narrative is, what. For example, one of the things that, just as we were looking at just doing some research on this show, there was an article that mentioned that quoted that Muslims are super spreaders of the coronavirus and have been ignoring physical distancing regulations and specifically about mosques being hotbeds for outbreaks, or Muslims getting preferential treatment. And this spread rapidly on outlets like Facebook and Twitter. So what are your thoughts on this? Did you come across much of this during this past year? And then while it was actually happening, like if you did see something like this, how would you handle this?
This is a really great question. We did see this both on an international level and on a domestic level. So what we saw was that the anti-Asian hate that began with the beginning of the pandemic then transitioned into the traditional scapegoats that are used in American media and discourse. So eventually it became blaming Muslims for the spread of the virus, when we know that the spread of the virus was happening in pockets of the country in large amounts because of systemic failures in this country, right? So we saw that there was a huge spike in the Midwest, in South Dakota, because workers were not given the resources in order to be able to stay home and stay safe, and were forced to work in meatpacking plants where the virus spread really quickly. So it has nothing to do with a particular ethnic group or a faith community. It has to do with economic levers in this country that don't provide the social resources that people need to live healthy lives and to navigate a pandemic in a safe way.
Yeah, I don't think Muslims were really the exception here. I think Asian Americans were blamed. I think Jewish Americans were blamed. Muslim Americans were definitely blamed. And I think that when there's a problem, a lot of times we try to find a scapegoat. And so we were one part of it. But in terms of what we did, so again, a lot of this was a reporter relationship. So we had people reach out to us and be like, how are Muslims being affected by this pandemic? And kind of just try to amplify the voices of people who were affected and the people who are doing really great work to do something about the pandemic and help other people.
Exactly. Just the fact that 20% of, so according to some numbers, doctors or health professionals are from the Muslim community. The amount of food, I cannot, millions of tons of food that was distributed by mosques across the country. Here at the DMV, we were monitoring that, and it's just amazing. The real beauty of the religion came out, and in the service of folks. So that was something, and that's it. And unfortunately, how do you deal with the fact that a lot of our community, which is a really beautiful part of it, wants to work in humility, wants to work with the right hand doesn't know what the left hand does. That's the ethos that a lot of us grew up with. So how do you convince then communities or organizations to really put their numbers out there?
Sorry, can you repeat that? How do we convince them to put what numbers out there?
The amount of work that they're doing, or the amount of people they're servicing, the food they're donating, or how many masks were done. Like we had a small group of women right here in the DMV, and we were working together, and we built the Muslim Mask Project. And like tens of thousands of masks were made and distributed, but most of the sisters were like, let's not draw attention to it. Let's just do it. We're doing it for God. So how do you get, that's sort of like a cultural barrier. How do you get beyond that?
I mean, it's not my place to tell you that you deserve news coverage, I don't think, but I think that if anyone is feeling like, oh, I can't talk about what I'm doing, news coverage helps you get attention, and attention helps you get a movement going, and it helps you get more volunteers and more donations. And so I guess if you feel uncomfortable, I would say, like, yeah, it's awkward being in the spotlight sometimes, but like, think about why you're doing this. It's not so you get the kudos, it's so that you bring people together.
This is an issue we face a lot. And I think our communities have come a long way in understanding the value of media as a tool. It's not about self-promotion. It's about promoting the work that's being done and helping that to have an impact on our communities. So we do spokesperson trainings around the country to equip those people who do this work, both as their professional, like full-time job, but also people who spend a lot of time, doing this as a volunteer or like a secondary activity. And what people find is that when they talk about the work, like one of the things I experience when I talk about the work that Rethink does is universally people will say, well, Muslims have a PR problem, right? South Asians have a PR problem. So there's a recognition that this is an issue that we need a solution to. And that when we provide the tools to do that, people see that these are issues that are being talked about us, but not often by us. And that it makes a real difference when someone from the community who's an expert on the issues, but also lives that experience, talks about it, so that the rest of the public understand what it really feels like to live out the reality when you're being targeted, or there's only one voice that's speaking on that issue, which often comes from an older generation, who are often men who often have a lot of power and money, and that's not the majority of people in this country.
Now, that's really important to have that diversity in the folks that are speaking for the community. And I find that often, and I've talked to a lot of organizers about this, like, how do we stop gatekeeping? How do we stop from being the same four people being the representative of the entire Muslim community, especially nationally as well as locally? And so those are some, and what I am seeing is there is an increasing awareness of this, and just even letting allies know that there are other people doing the work. There are a lot of local grassroots activists doing this work, and this is one thing that I try to do on the show, is really highlight local activists, so people may not have seen on the cover of magazines and stuff, but they are doing really powerful work. So and this is what this is, I believe, Rethink's the sort of work that you are doing is really beneficial for folks like that. I do believe we have a video where we wanted to show on some of the work that is being done. And while they're bringing that up, one thing that you mentioned building relationships with journalists. How important is that for a movement? How important is that for an organization?
It's very, very, very important. I cannot stress this enough. So I was working in journalism before I joined Rethink, and I remember someone messaged me one day and said, hey, I work on immigrants' rights work. Can we get a coffee? And I said, sure. And we did. And then I joined Rethink, and I learned that this is someone who Rethink works with regularly. And one of Rethink's tips to people is like, reach out to journalists, take them out for coffee. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so glad you did that, because she became such an important source for me and for the reporters I worked with. I was like, hey, just reach out to her. She's very quick to respond. And so I do think developing reporter relationships is very important in trying to figure out how to elevate the important work that you're doing, but also how to like craft a narrative beyond just you and your organization, but for the larger movement, which is what Rethink is trying to do, trying to bring everyone together and make sure that our messages are going through the most effective way that they can.
I agree. This is so critical that folks from our community have built relationships with reporters before something happens. So one of the things that Rethink works on is providing assistance to organizations in a time of crisis. And one of the things we stress is that a crisis is not the starting point for a relationship. You need to have relationships already there in order to be able to respond quickly. So we host sessions and panels where we invite journalists to have informal time with our spokespeople so that they can start that relationship building. And we facilitate that. And part of that is working with journalists like you, Hena, is journalists who understand the issues and are covering them and need to build out their Rolodexes. And it's important to us that the journalists also reflect the community that is being reported on, because they're doing some of the most incredible work, in-depth work, nuanced reporting about our communities. So we like to see that diversity reflected on both sides.
That's excellent, because one of the struggles that has been, I have been a journalist majority of my life, and getting the right people to speak. And a lot of times, even if it wasn't stories that I was covering, but there were others who were covering the same stories, but they were not speaking to the right people. And the stories that came out were very one-sided. And even though they were some absolutely fabulous reporters, but they didn't, because they're not sitting in the mosques. And so some of the CVE reporting that came out was very, from a security lens and not from a community lens at all. And just being able to say, hey, go talk to that imam who knows what it feels like that his basketball team has disintegrated because the parents don't want their kids to come to the masjid anymore because they think they might be targeted by the FBI or something. So this is like, those sort of stories are so important, and being a part of the community is so important. So thank you for that. If we have the video up, we could definitely show it now. And
the US citizen about 15, 20 years old, yes. And my brother didn't do nothing wrong.
Our rights are being eroded, and my America allows refugees and immigrants.
I haven't slept for more than 48 hours. I was scared. Yeah, I was super scared.
They said you are from Iraq, so you can't enter.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Even though you can ban our brothers and sisters from entering the country, you cannot ban the souls that will rise up against it.
can you tell us a little bit more about this movement?
I think this video was from before my time. Firdaus, do you know more about it?
Yeah, so this video, as you can see, is from the late 2016 to 2017, when Trump announced that he wanted to ban Muslims from entering this country, and then make good on that promise in his first week in office with the executive order. And as we know from there, what happened. So this video is highlighting the impact that it had on individuals and community members. And as we can see, it didn't just impact a particular group of people. It was broadly affecting Muslims, and most of the countries on the ban list were Muslims. So we could see what it looks like when folks from the community are given an opportunity to go on TV and to say, this is how my family is being affected. This is how we're showing up in the unprecedented airport protests that we saw, where activists and community members showed up in mass to say that this is not what we want to see. And that has been the prevailing message, that this is not what we want our country to be like, and that we will fight to make sure that we build a better future for ourselves and for people around the world.
And this is something that a lot of the people in the audience need to understand, that this narrative is formed. It doesn't just come out of thin air. People think, strategize, look at the problem and say, okay, this is from what we, with their expertise, they're able to say, okay, this is how we can fight back against these feelings. This is how we can get people's support from mainstream and humanize this issue. And a lot of times we think, and this is something that eventually the community learns, like different communities across the country have learned, like dreamers have learned this, how to show their faces and be able to show their stories. So this is something that definitely, when you watch these campaigns being played out, realize that a lot of work goes on behind it. And to speak to that, Adrienne or Firdaus, could you share a little bit from the background of what might go into a campaign like this?
Yeah, I can give it a stab. So I want to say just the Muslim ban. Obviously, Trump promised to cut down the entry of all Muslims into the United States. But what actually happened in January was an executive order targeting several Muslim majority countries. And I think everyone on this call remembers, but Rudy Giuliani later had an interview after the order was passed, and they said, how did this happen? And he said, Donald Trump came to me and said, how can we do a Muslim ban legally? And this is what we came up with. So on the other side, they are strategizing. What is the most effective way to get our policies across? What is the way that will be most palatable to Americans? And this was much more palatable than just outright banning all Muslims. And that's why it kind of went as far as it did. And so on our side, we have to sit there and say, okay, what is the most effective message to be like, this ban is not okay. This ban is tearing apart families. And how do we do that? How do we get the majority of Americans to understand? And so what we have done since the ban was put into place with the first executive order is we have done a series of polls of testing messages that are most effective, trying to see, okay, here's the arguments the other side is using, here are the arguments our side is using, how do we find out what is working and what is not working, and how do we push those frames forward and those types of messaging forward. So we've done it 3 times now, including around the Africa ban, after the ban was expanded to several Muslim majority countries, and including around the No Ban Act, which a lot of very great organizations helped push forward. The No Muslim Ban Ever campaign played a really great part. Muslim Advocates, NIAC, I'm sure a ton of other organizations that I'm not remembering right now. And so we're there to kind of help them and be like, hey, this is what we found works and this is what we found doesn't work. And trying to get the most effective messages across. What the other side is already doing, basically, we're trying to do the same thing for our side.
So what doesn't work?
What doesn't work? Great question. I think what doesn't work is, well, I can tell you the most effective message that we found in our last round of polling, which was that it's really helpful to put the Muslim ban in context of other discriminatory policies and other vulnerable communities in America that have been targeted under Trump's presidency. We are not a one-off. We are, I think that became even more obvious when the ban was expanded to several countries in Africa. And it's kind of being like, this is one part of the hate that we've seen the last 4 years, and we need to dismantle it to say that hate has no place in this country. So that's the most effective way.
That's really powerful, because a lot of times we get up and condemn, or we may use language that is negative instead of focusing on positive feelings of unity and the fact that this is another attack on minorities, just sort of language that unifies us with the community with the rest of the communities who are being impacted. Now, thinking back to, like, these 4 years have been extremely heavy for a lot of people who have been doing this work. But planning for 2021, this was an election year. We did see a spike in some violent acts against Muslims, especially in Canada, which was very interesting to note. But did you guys, did you also see a spike here in the United States during this election year?
Sorry, a spike in hate crimes, is that what you were saying? So we don't monitor hate crimes. I'm sure there are a lot of other great organizations who do. I know that SPLC was tracking, I guess, hate crimes around the election, specifically around on election day, and cases of voter intimidation. I haven't seen data around the election more broadly, but I do think, I mean, this is like not the greatest source of data, but the FBI did put out its annual hate crime data a few weeks ago, and Muslims are still up there. So,
and this is despite the community not being very active and reporting crimes.
Yes,
right?
yes, there are a lot of flaws with that data for sure.
I'll add there that election years are historically high in hate crime incidents. So, and we will know that later on. So the FBI hate crime data, which is very incomplete, as Adrienne already mentioned, releases its data for the previous year. So the data we have right now is from 2019. And what we saw was that it followed the trend of hate crimes rising year after year. And it was one of the highest in the past, I believe, decade. And so if that trend continues, when we see the full data from 2020 next year, we will likely see that it was pretty high as well. On the other hand, we're in a different year than 2019 in that it is in the middle of a pandemic. And so there's less public events and less public, activity. So I'm not sure how that will play into like the numbers because less people are out. But we know that, the rhetoric that inspires hate violence is still ongoing. People are still hearing those messages, and white nationalist groups have been very active. So we have to see when the data comes in to see what the picture really looks like.
So as, and now planning for 2021, what are some of the things that you all are pointing out to organizations? What should people be watching out for? I'd like to hear about that.
So one obvious thing is that Biden has promised to repeal the Muslim ban, and he's likely going to do it through an executive order, among a flurry of other executive orders shortly after he enters office. And so one obvious thing that we are working on with organizations is to talk about how that's not enough. Islamophobia did not start with the Muslim ban. It's not going to end with the repeal of the Muslim ban. And so there are other things that we need to talk about the drone war, about CVE, which you mentioned earlier, about these other forms of Islamophobia that we may see. We've seen a lot of Republican wins on the local level. And so I don't mean to make this a partisan thing, but I do think that we may see an uptick in local legislation targeting Sharia law. And so that's something to be keeping an eye on. And then the obvious big one that I'm sure everyone knows is that next year is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And so we're going to have to talk about how we talk about what's been happening the last 20 years to Muslims in this country and Muslims abroad.
Firdaus?
Yeah, there's been a lot of organizations that have built infrastructure and come a long way in just that last 20 years, but certainly in the last 30 and 40 years. So I think we're in a better place. And there's a lot of lessons that we've learned over the last 4 years with having to battle an administration that, specifically was targeting immigrants and Muslims and refugees. So we are in a better place to go further in advancing the rights of our communities. And many organizations, are aware that a Biden administration does not mean that the fight for this movement's fight is not over. And I feel optimistic that, we've had so many candidates who are Muslim and South Asian and Arab who've won their elections. So this is a real, I think, turnaround. And we are looking forward to seeing how, local groups work with people in office to advance better policies and legislation that do create a more positive future for all of our communities. So I think there's an opportunity to take the lessons that we've learned, and also that we're still being a pandemic and we have to be creative about the kind of work we do.
Mm-hmm. Do you encourage, so how does advocacy or media strategy change under different administrations? So, from our end, we saw in the last 4 years really heavily focusing on international religious freedom, or just religious freedom was something that helped us advocate for our causes with a majority Republican administration. What tips can you give to organizations who will be lobbying or doing advocacy under a Biden administration?
That's a good question. Honestly, a lot of the organizations are already doing great work, so I will not take credit for it. I think the biggest thing that we've learned is that it's great to have a united front, and that's a big reason why we do all of this messaging, to see what is effective, make sure everyone's using the same message so that it really comes across. So I think that's the biggest one, trying to make sure that you have a united front. Obviously, the most effective movements we've seen is not just one organization, but several organizations having come together to fight an unjust policy.
That's great.
I would say I don't think the tactics are different. You know, the principles are the same. The work and the movement continues. I think there's the feeling is maybe a little bit different. But in addition to having a coalition and a movement, so we're working in concert with each other, it does not mean everybody says the exact same thing or has all the same goals, but that we're working together as a team. And also we recognize that it's a multi-pronged approach. Some folks will be out on the front lines, others will be, working with their relationships with elected officials. Other people will be serving as elected officials or politicians or in an administration. And recognizing we all have different strengths that we can bring to the work is critical.
As we go into 2021, one of the things that comes to my mind often is liberal Islamophobia. So, and this is not talked about as often as the Islamophobia that we do see from the right wing, or that's blatant. What does liberal Islamophobia look like? How do you recognize it, and how do you work against it?
I think liberal Islamophobia looks like CVE. I mean, I think a lot of liberals would be in favor. I mean, I don't know the actual numbers, but I do think that is a staple example. And I think that the big thing is like, in the name of national security, it's okay. That's kind of a common talking point. Or like, Muslims are great allies in the fight against terror. I don't know how they exactly phrase it, but like, Firdaus, maybe you do know what I'm saying? It's like,
I think one of the easiest example to look at is actually looking at the previous election cycle, right? When we saw Trump and Clinton facing off in a presidential debate, and Trump said, Muslims need to report stuff, which is blatant Islamophobia, right? At the same time, Hillary, in that same moment, said that Muslims need to be the eyes and ears to help support the national security apparatus. And to me, that is the perfect example of what liberal Islamophobia looks like, is that you only recognize a community when it is a tool for your agenda and is not recognized as humans in their own right that deserve rights as humans. So, in the future, what we need to continue to fight liberal Islamophobia in addition to overt Islamophobia, which folks are already doing, but that's going to be that next stage of chipping away at that. And one of the ways that shows up is when people talk about a good Muslim versus a bad Muslim, right? Or a good immigrant versus a bad immigrant. So focusing on how doctors are serving a community, and because they're the ones who made it and have social standing and are serving the community during a pandemic. That is true, but there are also other folks who are working class folks who are putting their lives on the line to be service workers every day that support your standard of living. Those are not the stories that are the ones that jump into mainstream media. It's easier to talk to the doctor who's doing that work in the hospital in an affected area.
It is easier to talk to the doctor, but also I will say it's not always the most effective. So, for example, in our latest round of messaging and polling, we tested a message that a lot of folks were using, which was, we need to repeal the Muslim ban because we're in a pandemic and we need more doctors in this country. And we tried a message to that effect, and it was not the most effective message. It was not what won people over. What won people over was putting Muslims in a category of other targeted communities, these last 4 years, and kind of tying that kind of hate together and saying, like, this is not a one-off, this is one example and it needs to be repealed. And so that is a much more effective message than being like, look at the best among us, like, don't you want more of us here? And that's just not a winning message.
Exactly. And that's so powerful too, because a lot of times we do want to aspire to be that model minority. We are, this is who you want in the country. Why wouldn't you want, Van Jones? It's classic. Why wouldn't you want Muslims as neighbors? What a part of Rethink strategy is also working with the South Asian community. One question that has always come to my mind is, what do you do when the diaspora over here is working on as a minority together, but back, for example, Indian Muslims are suffering in India. There's 2 active genocide alerts for the country of India. And many of our allies over here who may have been working together in the South Asian diaspora, there's some amazing allies, Deepa and Arjun Singh, who've been just have put their lives on the line for for our community. But there are many, many who have been absolutely silent and have not spoken up about this. What advice would you have for that? Like, how do you address that?
So we work with a number of South Asian advocacy organizations that are doing the work that you're describing, and so I'm a South Asian diaspora person myself. So this is an issue that hits home, which is indicative of our team. Our team sits in the communities that we work with. This is a personal and a professional calling, and as we see, the South Asian diaspora is not a monolith, right? There is a range of experiences and ways that people have arrived in this country that inform their political philosophies. So we know that there is a network of, powerful, wealthy folks who support both right-wing policies in the U.S. There are South Asians for Trump, for instance, and that also support the Hindu nationalist movement back in the subcontinent. And there is networks that provide fiscal support to folks in the BJP in India. So that work there are advocates and activists working to mobilize communities in the US so folks understand what those networks look like and can divest from them and can choose to support folks who align with their values and put their money in places that align with their values. So our work, is the same, working with activists across these communities. What can we do to build their media engagement strategy? How can we support to make sure that those voices are the ones who are, doing interviews and are heard by, within the South Asian community and across, so we draw those connections with other communities, as Adrienne said. This is not, an isolated issue. We see that authoritarian regimes have been taking power across the world. India is not alone in this.
Exactly. Now, one of the things I remember from a Rethink Media, maybe it was an email that you all sent out, but it was localizing an international issue. So can you speak to that? From what I remember from that was, if, for example, you are an Indian Muslim, American of Indian heritage, and you're scared for your family, so then you would go out and speak to journalists from making this an American issue because Americans are being affected by this. So yes, any tips for our audience who might be listening in on that?
Tips on how to bring an international issue back home? I mean, I think in the world of 2020 and in a global pandemic, there is nothing that is, not anything that's happening somewhere else is also affecting us here. And so, like Firdaus said, there are a lot of really great organizations that have already figured that out. So related to South Asia, for example, Equality Labs is doing a lot of really great anti-casteism work. I'm not South Asian, so to me, it was not obvious that that's an issue that's happening in India, and that's an issue that's happening here and elsewhere. That's an issue that we need to be talking about, more globally. And so there are organizations that are already doing that really great work. So I would say, in terms of tips, like if there is an issue that you're interested in, you can definitely feel free to message me and Firdaus at any time, but you can also just try to find an organization that's already doing that work and figure out, like, how can I talk about this in my own family, and kind of take the cues from other activists that have already been doing that work. Honestly, you don't need to reinvent the wheel at any point.
Yeah, I'll give an example from another diaspora community that is suffering from the impact of an authoritarian regime, which is Uyghur Muslims who are being targeted by the Chinese government. And as you already mentioned, right, there is always a local angle on an issue, whether that's a national issue or an international issue. There is someone from that community who is working or has been impacted. I know there's a lot of Uyghur Muslims in the DMV area, and so they have shared their stories. Another angle on that story that, as someone who's not Uyghur but can connect to that issue, is looking at what are the consumer goods that are produced by forced Uyghur labor that you can easily buy. So Nike, the brand Nike has cotton materials that are produced by Uyghur forced labor. And that's something that is a local issue for anybody if they're shopping for Nike apparel online or going to an outlet store. And it's not the only company. There's many companies because, again, we live in a globalized world where supply chains are, very complex. And so multiple companies are benefiting from that labor, similar to the BDS movement, right? There's so many companies that are connected.
True. Yes. Thank you. And yes, shout out to our Save Uyghur campaign. That's one of the projects that we work on. We've been working on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That's my day job. We do this all the time. So thank you for bringing that point up. But I do want to get back to you when you said that there are many great organizations, and yes, definitely don't recreate the work, join them. But what happens is a lot of times we'll get, for example, an Indian Muslim, they're in Wyoming or Wisconsin, right? And they want to spread awareness in their local community. They might not be connected to a larger organization, but they want to spread the information in their local, so how would you frame that story? Like where their local paper can cover them and cover their issues, bringing that larger rise in fascism home. So that's what I was asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of the rise in fascism, I think that, white supremacy is related to Islamophobia, is related to racism more broadly, is related to the rise of the far right and the Hindutva in India. Like, I think these are all very, very linked, and there's an easy way to kind of bring it back home. You can talk about diaspora communities at home. You can talk about the types of hate that are very, very closely linked, and you don't have to be Indian or Muslim or South Asian to be worried about the rise of fascism in India, for example. You can just look at what's happening at home and be like, wow, maybe there's some similarities here, and we need to start talking about why this type of thought is on the rise in general. So I guess that's how I would go about it.
And for those folks who are doing that work, there is something that motivates you to join that fight or that movement. And everyone is an expert in their personal story. So I would tell those folks to start with their personal story. What is it that drives them to do this work? Is it, a sense of justice? Is it your grandmother's story? Is it something else? And you start from there, because people build, empathy and connection based on emotions. Humans are emotional creatures, and understanding what drives someone to do something and seeing that depth is something that will pull people along into your issue.
That's a very good suggestion. One of the best ways that we one of our top suggestions for people talking about the Muslim ban was to talk about your personal stories. So I don't know if other folks remember, but shortly after the ban was passed, there was like the grandma ban. A lot of people were sharing photos of their grandmas that were banned from this country, and just like ordinary stories of families that were affected by it. That was really, I think, what made a big difference.
It really did. I remember a story of a young Sudanese couple who were stuck at the Jeddah airport. And that story was just so heartbreaking. They had just gotten married. They couldn't go to the Sudan. They couldn't come to the US, and they couldn't go back into Saudi Arabia because the young woman's ikama had been canceled as soon as she got married to her husband. So that story was just like put everything together of how this ban is affecting people's lives, and people are being stuck at airports. So, well, thank you so much. We've come down to the end of the hour. Thank you so much for everything that you all shared, and we're looking forward to getting more tips from Rethink Media in 2021 as we continue this movement of building peace and justice around the world, especially here in our own backyard. So thank you to both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
We really enjoyed being here, Hena. Thank you so much.
To all of you, yes, as you heard, Nike and Apple and Coke are all lobbying against the bill that we've been working so hard on. So I do urge all of you to get on your phones and use our calling tool and call your senators to push to help pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Act. This is an act that will help you stop buying goods that you don't want to buy that are made with enslaved people's labor. I've heard this from many communities across that it's so hard to boycott China, and it is. So this bill will make it easier for you. So we need to put the pressure on Congress to get this bill passed. So pick up your phones and make those calls. Assalamu alaikum.